Ladies and gentlemen, we're keeping you from lunch, but we have a topic that I think should chill all of us. There's a lot of talk about nuclear escalation. It's not just what's going on inside Russia. The Chinese are also building up their own nuclear stockpile. They were at 300 for many, many years, but now they're building up again. North Korea seems unrestrained by anyone. The Americans and Russians are developing new kinds of weapons. There's no nuclear arms discussions going on, really. There's been an extension of one agreement only, but only for a short time. So we find ourselves, I think, in a world of some peril. And we have, I think, an extremely good panel to talk about this, led by Mr. Ban Ki-moon, as you all know, former Secretary General to the United Nations, but also a South Korean who lives in the shadow of the North. So that's intriguing. Angelina Eichhorst, who is a very senior European diplomat. She is, what's exactly her title, Managing Director for the European External Action Service, someone who's also dealt with European enlargement, dealt with Ukraine, so is a perfect person for this panel. And my friend Jeff Sachs, who we've all met, who is incredibly well prepared through his experiences as a thinker and economist to talk about this issue to us as well. But what I'd like to do is start with Mr. Ban.
Yes.
And if you could tell us, is the world in peril? Are we exaggerating the problem? What worries you? Do you think about nuclear issues? Or, like most of us, do you just repress the thought and hope that it never comes to the surface?
Thank you for your warm introduction. It's not exaggeration. I think what we have been thinking, that we may be living in a rather fragile society, but it is much, much more than fragile. Now, it's a nightmarish scenario. The Russian government, one of the P5, one of the largest nuclear power state, President Putin has announced that after he had said that the nuclear weapon will be on a special alert, now he said that he's not bluffing. He's not bluffing, that he may use nuclear weapons for all those neighboring European countries if they intervene in the Ukrainian situation. I think this has become much, much more a serious issue. On top of that, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un on September 8th, just 3 weeks ago, has publicly announced that North Korea will launch nuclear weapons for preemptive strike if and when they feel, this is quite arbitrary, if they feel that there is an imminent signs of attack against himself and any command and control systems. This is again much, much serious, much worrisome statement, even than what the President Putin said. They are irresponsible person. They do not abide by any international norms and rules. They do not accept this NPT. On top of these very serious issues, now international community is not fully in control of all these regimes, institutions. Like, for example, United States government has recently withdrew from this intermediate range nuclear forces treaty 2 years ago in 2019. This treaty is very important, but they have withdrawn. This is again irresponsible. Then on top of this, beside this, there are issues of like Russians having attacking Zaporizhzhia nuclear power stations. This is again very irresponsible. This must be condemned. To deal with all these nuclear power stations with the weapons. Now, there are again another issues like chemical weapons. Ambassador Kim has been in charge of all these disarmament issues when he was working at the United Nations. Then OPCW, Organization for Prohibition of this chemical weapons, is not fully functioning. When the Syrian government used chemical weapons in 2012 against the civilian population, I, as a Secretary General, initiated a special investigative mission. But it was just limited. Because of the lack of support from the Security Council, we were able to only find out whether chemical weapons was used or not. We are not authorized, we are not mandated to find out who used this one.
Right.
That was, again, I had some serious quarrel at that time with the President Obama at the last minute when he was asking us to withdraw chemical weapons investigation team, even before the investigation was due, because he seemed to have been considering to bomb Syria at that time. Somehow, his effort was dropped by the Parliament, Congress.
Well, it was blocked by himself and Dennis McDonough when they walked in the Rose Garden after David Cameron failed to get his own parliament to support.
In fact,
let me ask you a question, if you don't mind, Mr. Bond. You live in South Korea. You have a North Korean regime which President Trump tried to have a conversation with about nuclear disarmament, clearly failed. Do you feel you don't have nuclear guarantees from the United States? It's not like NATO. Do you feel safe enough? Would you want more from your allies, more guarantees, more? I mean, the question we always used to ask in the old days is, would we trade New York for Paris? Now we ask, would we trade Seattle for Seoul? And I think the question is much less clear. So I'm curious what you think.
When it comes to North Korea, it's a matter of confidence and trust. We really tried to negotiate. Even myself was a negotiator, one of the 5 negotiators when Korea and North Korea agreed to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. There was an agreement, declaration was adopted in December 1991. I was negotiating. And later, I was working as a vice chairman of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. It's a matter of question of trust, how much we can trust. Many successive Korean presidents and US President Trump, they seem to be almost declaring that they have done full just to make sure that North Korea would denuclearize. In fact, Kim Jong-un told us, according to the delegations who met Kim Jong-un, that he confirmed that this is the will of his grandfather, Kim Il-sung. So there is no way we cannot keep this denuclearization promise. But it has become proven to be complete lie. The former president, he went to North Korea and got all this promise. He said that he got promise and signed, but now Kim Jong-un on September 8th announced in his own mouth that whether and even though they may be under sanction of international community for 100 years, they will never give up nuclear weapons. And the most worrisome is the very arbitrary position that whenever they feel that there is some imminent danger against him and the command systems, then they will use preemptive strike. This is a much, much worse situation. No country in the world has ever said so.
So no one is very happy, that's for sure, and no one feels very safe. I have Japanese friends who are very anxious too. But let's turn to Europe, Ambassador Eichmann. The JCPOA, which your organization has been trying to revive, seems basically dead in the water. I try to cover these talks. They're not going anywhere. They don't seem to be going anywhere. There's a war, whatever its roots, in Europe, not inside the EU, but in Europe. There's rumors, worries, promises of threats, not a bluff, whatever that means, nobody's sure. How is Europe responding? Do people actually take this seriously? I mean, is there something you can actually, that Europe qua Europe can actually do about it? Or is it, once again, huddling under the American arm and saying, oh, well, there's that umbrella, it's okay? What do you think?
These are many points in one, Stephen. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my first time on the panel, so I'm really happy to be here. And I love the energy in the room, and I want to keep up the energy because I think with all the concerns we have, and there are plenty and many, and the Secretary General is absolutely right to draw us to North Korea, rightly so. I appreciate it very, very deeply. And I realize when we work on the continent, on the daily business of trying to keep the aggressor away, as we should say, we should also keep the energy, particularly for all the young people here in the room who, this previous panel had a fantastic optimism of what can be done. But that aside, on all the points you mentioned, Stephen, perhaps very quickly, one by one, JCPOA, I hope all of you in this audience agree that it would be extremely important to have the Joint Action Plan up and running again. I hope you all agree. I mean, I'm sitting very often in audiences where even on this one there's no agreement. But it is hugely important, and the European Union will continue to facilitate the talks. Josep Borrell, the High Representative, as you know, is the main facilitator. His team with Enrique Mora, it's a fantastic team, trying to continue to inject not just the energy, but actual proposals. It's not yet dead. The talks, there is still work ongoing, right? I mean, the time span is very, very narrow. I look immediately at the United States midterms, etc. We know this, but the work is ongoing. And this is basically my answer to everything we face today. The work of the level of input of the people who face these challenges every day, and it's not just the institutions, believe me, it is also the people on the ground, is incredible, because this keeps us on our toes 24/7. Now, how do you explain to the public the 450 million people on the continent in the EU, but it's more so even globally? And I hear you all saying, but look, this is a war in Europe, this is not a war globally. It's not true, frankly, because you can see how the aggression from the Russian side is affecting us all globally. We can discuss why. I'm open to all the discussions, but the point is that we will not stop being very assertive in putting the energy in trying to stop as much as we can. Stopping the aggression, whether it's nuclear, and I agree with you fully on North Korea, but we have 9 declared nuclear states, And they all are mobilizing, diversifying, increasing. So that is still out there. And that sort of undermines the whole essential part of deterrence we need. And that used to work. For 80 years, there was a taboo on actual use aggressively in an attack nuclear weapons since the 21st of September. And you did mention North Korea, but I think the shock that was felt in New York by the message from President Putin was very profound. You know, it's like, hey, wait a minute, what's happening here? And I hope you all felt that too, because that is serious. That doesn't mean we do not have ways to go about it, and I'm happy to come back to it, Stephen, but I just want to say that the only way of facing these issues is by working through dialogue, fully agree, hand in hand on using all the tools we have. We may need more sophisticated tools because we are dealing with more sophisticated aggressors, for sure, but we will not stop.
So I'll just follow up quickly and just ask you if to me it's not very logical. I can't see the point of Russia exploding even a demonstrative tactical device, but should they do it? How would the European Union respond?
Well, to be frank, it's enough that President Putin said, you know, I'm not bluffing here. This is in itself, it is very serious, whether it's going to happen or not. But you have to continue to deter, for sure. And what is important, and I think what it did, it has isolated President Putin further. Because here we have seen, in New York, elsewhere globally, China and India and others, they already spoke up more clearly. They also see, you know, if this is not being contained, we are all in deep, deep trouble. So what I do see is actually there was much more work and conversations going on than at the beginning of the war with China and India and others who are equally concerned about a possible use of nuclear weapons.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, are we sleepwalking into nuclear conflict, or are we exaggerating the threat? What do you think?
There's no doubt we are at the brink of a nuclear war. Again, and not for the first time. 60 years ago, this month, or in October, we were at the hair's breadth of nuclear conflict. And the United States was ready for a nuclear war. And in fact, had Kennedy's advisors prevailed on Kennedy to launch an attack against Cuba in the Cuban Missile Crisis, as all of his advisors said, we would have had a full nuclear war.
Yeah.
And we're playing with this fire right now. Putin is not bluffing. And Zelensky is completely wrong to say we're going to militarily defeat Russia and push them out of Crimea. Because if that happens, there will be a nuclear war before that ends. And we should tell him that. But we don't speak the truth either in the international scene. The Ukrainians are reckless in their rhetoric. Okay, they're fighting an aggressor, but we cannot have a nuclear war over this issue. And we have no plans to avoid one right now. From Russia's point of view, this is a core security challenge. And Crimea means a lot to Russia, more than we perhaps understand. And so this loose talk is absolutely reckless and provocative. And the Ukrainian leadership says, well, there may be a nuclear war. That's reckless talk too. It's all over the place right now. Even Israel, which by the way is the 10th nuclear power, just they don't say it, but come on. We have 10 nuclear powers. The Prime Minister of Israel stood in the podium and threatened Iran with war last week. I was sitting right in front of him in the General Assembly. That's also reckless. So we have a lot of reckless talk all over the place. Nothing's under control right now, nothing. And since everything is lies and messaging and sound bites, it's even worse than usual because everybody's pandering for a news cycle. No one is being sensible and reasonable behind the scenes even. There is no behind the scenes. There's only the pandering of the news cycle.
But this is what, sorry. Just to follow up, if I can, because as I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we still debate, basically there was a kind of secret deal, private deal, between the Americans and Khrushchev, so that the Russians, the Soviets pulled their missiles out, and we pulled our missiles out of Turkey.
Yes.
And we pretended that had nothing to do with anything.
Right.
Do you see is there a potential for this kind of conversation in the current conflict? Or, as you say, do you think people are just talking past one another? I mean, is there serious diplomacy? I don't know.
Yes.
I mean, going on. Yeah.
The best book written on this topic was written a couple of years ago called Gambling with Armageddon by the historian Martin Sherwin. I recommend everybody read it. It's brilliant. He passed away the following year. He had spent his whole life on nuclear diplomacy. And this is absolutely the most remarkable hour-by-hour account of what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was ended by compromise. Unfortunately, and I love President Kennedy and wrote a book about him about the year following the Cuban Missile Crisis in his pursuit of the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. But Kennedy did one thing which damaged the follow-up. He kept secret the fact that the crisis was ended by diplomacy. It was not ended by a showdown. But in the public imagination, it was ended by a showdown that Kennedy won and that Khrushchev lost. And this is untrue, and it was compromise that saved the world. You want to save the world right now? It's easy. Biden picks up the phone and calls Putin and says, we're not expanding NATO to Ukraine. That saves the world. That is what this war is about and has been about for 30 years. And what we're told is lies. And if Biden wants to stop this, he can stop this. But they don't want to stop it because it has been a project of the U.S. government to expand NATO since 1992, and a project of American neoconservatives to absolutely expand American power everywhere in the world since 2002. And so we're in a crisis because we have nuclear superpowers confronting each other over core security issues and not telling the truth about it. NATO has no business being in the Black Sea, in Crimea, in Georgia. It's reckless, and the Europeans know it, but they won't say it, because European leaders have told me this for years, how much they disagreed with George W. Bush Jr. in 2008 in Bucharest when he pushed NATO enlargement. They knew it was reckless. But Europe doesn't speak up against the United States.
But it did that.
That's the biggest problem. We need Europe to be Europe and to defend its own interest. And Europe's interest is to tell the United States, stop pushing so dangerously. This would make a huge difference and help Europe enormously.
Let me follow up with Angelina, if I may, because there's a lot of talk from Macron and others about how the United States is no longer a reliable partner that American politics is too polarized, that American foreign policy is no longer consistent, that since the Trump administration goes up and down, and yes to JCPOA, no to JCPOA, Macron would argue in the face of China, Europe needs its own positioning, but it also needs its own defense. It needs to have, as Borrell, your boss, says, the language of power. Well, the language of power is one thing. Power is another thing. It's not language, which I think he knows. I hope he knows. Sometimes I wonder if Europe knows that language isn't power. But is this becoming more enhanced with the Ukraine war? I mean, or is it, once again, thank God the Americans are there, they're doing the leading, they're telling us what the sanctions should be, we're just going to let them run it. That's a little unfair, but you understand the question.
Yeah, no, I get it fully. I think the point here is for the European Union, 27 member states, right? Very different. We know the whole story. And I want to say a few words on enlargement, but for the EU, because it's important to keep in mind what's happening there. But we, in fact, since the 21st of February, everything we were supposed to be doing 10 years before has accelerated rapidly with amazing speed, whether it was on defense. We have this strategic compass. I'm not going to bother you with all these technical words, but in fact, what we are saying that today on defense cooperation, it has never been that strong intra-state, interstate. And yes, we have a very, very good relationship with the United States today, with the Biden administration. We work much closer and more frank with each other, and we say a lot of things to each other, than before, because it was actually the Trump administration also showed us that we have to stand on our own. We had to build that old resilience, as we call it. It's not just a bureaucratic term, but it's a lot of work. On energy, we should have had this independence on energy, of course. There were many who were saying, why don't you have an energy union where you really put all your resources together? And that's now is happening constantly on each and every area of cooperation. So the very essence of the EU, which is cooperation. Look, the EU is a peace project. It's not a state, we are an entity, right? But it's about peace, and it is defending the values we stand for. No occupation, no threats, certainly no nuclear threats from the EU. And those who want to join us, it's not because we push them to, but they are asking. We have 10 countries lined up to be member of the European Union. Why is that? We are not telling them, we're not forcing them, please Turkey join us, please Serbia, Albania, now it's Ukraine, Moldova, even Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Georgia, we know them all. We are not telling them you have to join us, and if you don't, you have to pay the price. They are asking, they want to be member of the EU. Right. And that is very important to keep in mind why that is. We are not forcing them, right? And we're very cautious in what the EU can do, what NATO can do, what the United States can or should do. We know this division of roles very, very well. So
great.
I just want to keep it there.
Thank you. Mr. Bone, you wanted to come in?
Well, for the sake of debate, I think
Please.
Anybody can say anything. But for the purpose of unity, and in principle, while I have deep respect for Professor Jeffrey Sachs, there are some points which I cannot agree with you. Then what will happen if the people, the status of Donbass, where partially Russians have taken, and they are taking so-called voting, whether they will be merged into a Russian federation or they will remain it. But all these can be easily fabricated and easily mobilized by Russian Federation. When it comes to Crimea case, It happened during my time as the Secretary General. It's not that there was not any reactions about this, but the problem was that then President Yanukovych was a very pro-Putin, pro-Russian president. Just before he fled, I had really serious quarrel with him in Moscow, at the time of just a few days before he fled. Then, to be frank, when Russia annexed this Crimea, the United Nations and all other, even Americans, didn't react much negatively. It happened that way, in the name of voting by the people. Then under the leadership, under all this support of President Yanukovych, and you know what happened in Ukraine at that time. There was a big demonstrations against Ukraine, against the Ukrainian prison, against this one. In Moscow, I had nobody. I was just a quiet and a gentle person, and I really, really wanted to maintain good relationship with any head of state. But for any such dictators and those people like Yanukovych, I really brushed my face and diehard quarrel with him. Yeah. You must not do this way. You must listen to the voices of the people. Then what happened? Just 3 days or 4 days later, he fled. Yes. I think he must be somewhere under protection of Putin. So we should understand this one. Then if we apply the logic of Professor Sachs, then what will happen to Donbass and other southern places where they are now taking a vote? Then will they be just automatically transferred to, incorporated into Russian Federation? That's something which we have to do. About the relationship between European Union and America, I know that during the time of President Trump, he was really forcing the European Union. It was almost divisive. So I was really very worried, concerned about the way President Trump was forcing European Union. Their partners, their allies. That was not the proper policy vis-a-vis very important allies. Now, then, I'll just stop there. Then, what would be done at this time? Still, if I may say so, I may be sometimes known as pro-American. No, it's not. I am just talking about the principles. Still, we need U.S. leadership. Whether the Cuban Missile Crisis was done with the negotiation or negotiated settlement, it saved billions of people's lives. In that regard, we have to highly applaud Kennedy's leadership. That's why Kennedy is still respected and admired for his leadership. At this time, the unity between solidarity and unity between European Union and United States should be further strengthened without any signs of division.
Good.
Otherwise, you will be used by Russia or any other.
Well, these are interesting histories. I was in the Maidan. I was there when Yanukovych fled. I sometimes think had he stayed at home, none of this would have been necessary. But that's an interesting conversation. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. We're coming to a close.
Since we are time now,
I want to give Jeff a chance.
My suggestion at this time, let us revive the Nuclear Security Summit meeting, which was initiated by President Obama in 2010. Unfortunately, this Nuclear Security Summit ended in 2016 when President Obama was also leaving just a couple of months later. It happened first in 2010 in Washington, second in Seoul, Korea, third in Netherlands. That was the last, but President Obama really wanted to do one more summit meeting. 58 state, whether they are nuclear power state or not, some possible and very strong and reasonably strong and responsible member state of the United Nations. 58 member states participated in 4 times. I think this is time for United States President Biden to reconvene Nuclear Security Summit, because never in the past have we seen this kind of very die-hard, serious situation over this nuclear weapons might be used. That's my suggestion.
Okay, thank you. A good one. We have 2 minutes and 35 seconds left. Jeff, do you want to respond to the Secretary General?
Yeah. Of course, we've not discussed these issues in detail, but I was also in the Maidan, and my very strong impression was that the United States contributed to the overthrow of Yanukovych. Of course, there was popular movement, but there was also a U.S. role that was very direct. And that was one of the reasons why so much happened afterwards. There was a lot of violence on the Ukrainian side. There was a lot of U.S. role. Some of it was captured online and released by Russian security. Victoria Nuland speaking so pleasantly about Europe, by the way, but also Victoria Nuland, who is one of our neoconservatives and married to one of our leading neoconservatives in the United States, is the Undersecretary of State of the United States today under the Biden administration, the one that contributed to the overthrow of Yanukovych in 2014. The Russians see that as a coup and as a pretext for the actions that they took subsequently. I think there's truth to that. Not all the truth, but some. So there are perspectives on both sides. But this has never been explained because nothing of U.S. foreign policy is ever publicly explained. That's the first rule. Everything needs to be deciphered. You have to be on the inside to see with your own eyes, as I happen to be in the Maidan by weird quirk of fate. Otherwise, you don't see it. We depend on the New York Times to tell us these things. And sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But the story is much more complicated from my point of view. Similarly, I would say that the JCPOA was killed by the United States. Let's be clear. Trump walked out of it, and the Iranians are right. What is this? We negotiate, then you continue the sanctions, then you make more demands, and then all the complaints are about Iran. What about the United States? It's unbelievable. And why did the North Korean negotiations fail? My impression is 2 words. John Bolton. I may be wrong, but the United States never followed through on what it promised. Maybe 4 words. John Bolton, Bill Clinton. Because there were specific promises made to North Korea, none of them fulfilled. That's a little simplistic, but there's 2 sides to these issues. And our problem is we pretend that there's one side to them. So if we get people together negotiating, and if we make foreign policy transparent, not a hidden game, I think we will make the world a lot safer. That's my
Great. I think that's a very good place to end this panel. I want to thank Mr. Bond, Ambassador Eichler, Professor Sachs, and you for your patience. And now you can have lunch.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
朋友都知道我是很挑剔的，防晒乳我选 KS 皇家呵护抗光清爽高防晒凝露，因为它有媲美蓝光神盾的抓藻植萃，保护我在阳光下延缓肌肤老化，维持青春弹力，可以防御工作环境里的3C 商品，各种光源对肌肤的伤害，擦起来清爽不黏腻。我特别喜欢它做到海洋友善。365天，天天抗光抗老化，是我的保养日常。你呢？呵护您，呵护全家人，专属你的 KS Royal Care 抗光清爽高防晒凝露。